This is John Nugent.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class. Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. Glad to have you along. We are starting this episode with a weird question. John wanted to bring it up. I don't know where his headspace is. But the question is, what is the worst pain you've ever found yourself in? We're going to stick with physical, not get into emotional pain. But physical pain your body has ever gone through. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, this was an easy one for me. So when I was 16, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, which is a form of cancer. And this was back in 1983, beginning of 84. So it was quite some time ago. And went through a lot of different tests as they were trying to narrow down what was going on. And one of the things they had to do was take a bone marrow sample. And they took it out of my hip. And I was just talking to someone within the last few days who had to go through the same thing. What they have to do is they have to shove a needle through your bone to get into the bone marrow. And so they numb everything up so you can't feel it. But if that needle goes out of that numbed area, I swear this is the worst pain I ever felt in my life. I have never screamed in pain except for in that moment. And they did the best they could. I mean, I'm not faulting the doctors or anything, but it's hard to avoid getting out of that. And I just remember being in the hospital, they're trying to take it out. And it is a vivid memory that I carry to this very day. I can't even begin to put a number on how much that hurt and how glad I was when they were done. It was horrific. So there you go. Worst pain I've ever experienced in my entire life.
Wow. Well, mine was also the hip.
Yeah.
Yeah. It must be sensitive area.
Well, it was a large bone that they could get into.
Yeah, right.
Mine was I had a bulging disc that was compressing on a nerve. This was brought about by me spending too much time on a roof project.
Yep.
And I went home. I just kept medicating and just pushing through and keeping working. And we were ripping all the shingles off and bending over in weird positions. And that night I've got chronic low back issues. So I kind of knew not to do that as much, but just something triggered that day on that project. And I woke up in the middle of the night with the worst pain I've ever had. And I couldn't sit still. And so I wanted to go downstairs because I didn't want to keep my wife up all night. There's no reason two of us can't get any sleep, right? And I attempted to walk downstairs because even when my back is hurt, I've been able to walk. Maybe not straight up, but at least bent over or something like that. But I could at least walk. And the pain was so strong in my hip that I couldn't put any weight on that leg, just none. And I was literally crawling, like army crawling down the hallway.
Oh my gosh.
And I didn't make it all the way down the hallway before I had to call for my wife to help and somehow help me get downstairs so that she could sleep and I could at least not have to worry about keeping her awake. And that's the incident that put me in the hospital that led to the surgery that shaved off that part of the disc. But for some reason, the pain that came out of that was so severe. I've never experienced anything like it.
Wow. That's intense.
Yeah. I think mine probably was a back issue. I also have chronic back pain issues, but I remember a particular time where I was supposed to be watching my newborn child carries at work, and I had to call somebody else up because I couldn't get off the ground. But I'm not going to talk about that. Another one was probably not as painful, but more vivid in my mind. I was walking up the steps, and I tripped a little, and I caught myself and probably broke my pinky, right? It was bad, it hurt, whatever. Well, about a week later, Carrie went into labor with Sophia, and I was there being a dutiful husband. And as she's giving birth, she grabs my hand with a broken, and she squeezed the living daylights out of that thing. Ooh, and I can't say anything. She's giving a child coming out of her body. I'm the center of the broken pinky, but it hurt.
Oh, she looked up and saw Sam crying. It was like,
it's such a touching moment. Yeah, I didn't think it'd impact him this much.
At least you didn't pass out from the pain or anything.
I felt like I was close, but
wow.
Like I said, the back was probably more painful, but that one was a very a moment.
So the back one, was that when Elijah was being born?
Well,
so
he was already born.
Okay.
And Carrie went back to work, and I was staying home with him, and I couldn't pick him up. I just was laid flat out.
Wow.
Dang. Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that you got quite a laugh out of the Pinky thing after Sophia was born.
Sure. I tell people, like, I know what it's like to give birth to a child. I've experienced the pain.
Yeah, right.
All right. Well, that's our talking point.
Yeah.
There you go. Now our jaws are loosened up and we can, speak and get going here.
Yeah, so we're continuing our series on how Christians should relate to the governing authorities. And last week we began the part of the series that focuses on what is the political calling of God's people? Like, what is our mission, our calling, specifically as it relates to governance and the kinds of institutions that regulate the behavior of people in wider society and help them cooperate in ways that are just. So we started last week by focusing on the two founding events of Israel in its calling, which is the call of Abraham to leave Babylon area and go to the land God would show them, and the call of the Israelites as a nation out of Egypt back to the land of Canaan, where God called Abraham, that they might become a set-apart people. And we looked at kind of like Israel's constitution. Like Deuteronomy sometimes has this section that's like the Constitution of Israel, and where it kind of lays out their politics and their procedures and their authority figures, or different civil servants that serve the organizational needs of the wider people. And we notice God established a different kind of governance in his people. Like God is their king, and under him are a plurality of humans that bear responsibility for different aspects of the life of God's people. And those people are scattered among 12 tribes. And God is over all the tribes. And no one tribe is over all the others. Power, responsibility, authority is scattered among the tribes, such that governance happens on the local level. And, we spoke at length about, but God anticipated that Israelites would want a king, because that's what they're used to. That's what all the other nations have. He anticipated the alternative model to the one he set up with his people. And he says, if you want a king, I'll let you have one, but he can't be like all the other kings. He can't have multiple wives, can't go to Egypt for horses and chariots, can't set himself above the people, can't make himself rich. And he must basically be the Torah king, have priests by their side that help him as he reads Torah to learn God's will for his people, such that the king is more of a mediator of God's rule over the people, in tandem with the priests and the elders and the judges and the prophets, all doing their part. The king among them helps mediate God's vision for the thriving of his people, which is laid out in Torah. God rules his people through Torah, and there's a plurality of humans, even throw a king in the mix, who can serve a function to execute God's vision. So as we think about Israel, right, and how did they connect with the politics of the other nations? Well, they saw themselves as set apart from those nations. They had a different purpose than those nations, because their purpose was to be a blessing to all nations and to live a life that was attractive to other nations, that would attract nations to them and not them go out and take nations for themselves, right, and enslave nations. Like, they had a different politics, a different end game, and a whole different way of ordering their lives according to principles that are pretty much diametrically opposed to how kingship like the nations worked.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you were to ask an Israelite, how do you relate to the governing authorities of the world? We are set apart from them. We're totally different from them. We've got a calling and mission from God that's different than theirs. And so we don't really make use of their structures. We're not even allowed to make alliances with people in those structures, because we have a different mission and there's a different way to accomplish it. But it has governing structure, right? It has a way of life. It has an organizational schema by which people live and by which justice is ensured among the people. It's just not the world's. Right. And there was just no effort on Israel's part, well, as laid out in Torah and God's vision for them, they wouldn't think to blend God's mission and people with that of the governing authorities around them.
Yeah.
So
the question is,
yeah.
that's Israel, right? We're not Israel. We're the church. And so, so the question when you get to the New Testament is from God's design for Israel in Torah, which, by the way, they didn't follow, and they
Right.
eventually became a nation like the nations, who had a king just like the nations, and left the Torah vision behind and became just like the other nations. And when they do that, God removes their political autonomy, right? And brings the whole Israelite kingdom crashing down, removes their king, takes it away from them, and basically disempowers them.
Yes.
If you're not going to do this my way, we're not going to do this at all. Right? It's
I
kind
like
of
that, yeah.
how the Old Testament ends and says, but I'm not done with you.
Yeah.
I have a vision for your thriving and your mission that I'm going to reveal.
Mhm.
And you have to wait when I renew the covenant and I send you my kind of Messiah who's going to get my kind of kingdom up and running. And you have to wait for that. So the question is, when that Messiah comes, who we know as Jesus, does he reverse what was going on in Torah? Like in Torah, it's like nothing like the nations, totally separate from the nations. But now that Messiah is here, is this a retraction? You know, now we're going to do things more like the nations. You know,
Sure.
Right.
where is Jesus and his whole project in relationship to the lessons we learned from Israel? Because he comes with a kingdom agenda.
Without a doubt, yeah.
And how does that agenda relate to Israel's agenda? How is it alike? How is it different? And what does that mean for us?
Mhm.
Who wants to take a stab at it?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in right now because this is a part of the story that I just love it so much because
The New Testament.
yeah, you know, the last third of the Bible. Because I think Jesus comes in and he fulfills that vision of what a king should look like. But it's so radically different than the kingship of the nations that nobody can really like rally around it. But everything about the gospel seems to come back to this idea of Jesus as king, you know, and I think of Matthew, who in his genealogy just establishes Jesus is a part of the Davidic line. If you go back to that genealogy, in John's gospel, you know, Pilate says to Jesus, "Are you a king?" You know, or early on when Nathanael meets him, he's like, "You're the Son of God, the King of Israel." Like this is just language that comes up over and over again. And in Matthew's gospel, you've got, you know, the kingdom of heaven versus everybody else, kingdom of God, which, you know, are also very interesting. It's all interesting language to use. And so God hasn't abandoned Israel's function. He's like, all right, we're going to get this king now. You're going to get this, you know, shoot from the stump of Jesse. But he's going to show you what I was thinking about way back when in Deuteronomy 17, I said, this is how a king should function. And Jesus absolutely undermines the human view of kingship. He's still a king, but he's like, let me show you what God was thinking. When he gave those instructions that we read back in Deuteronomy, I am now going to live that out, and I'm going to be that king. Jesus is the king of Israel.
You know, it has just dawned upon me for the first time. I want to throw something out there.
All right?
As you were saying that, I was thinking about Jesus as fulfilling Deuteronomy 17.
Yeah.
How much does he live out that vision of a king? He's not to have many wives. Jesus?
Zero.
Zero. He's not
Mary
to amass. What's that?
Mary Magdalene, but that's wow. Sorry.
Right, yeah.
That was a very bad movie. Or book, or both. I don't know.
Idea, theology.
He's not supposed to amass great wealth for himself.
Yeah.
Jesus is a beggar. Like he's the poorest of the poor. He's not to cultivate a standing army with horses and chariots. And
Yeah.
Jesus does absolutely nothing with the sword and tells people
Yeah.
this is not how we do this, and advocates enemy love and turn the other cheek. His kingdom is not like the kingdoms of this world. And Torah, like Jesus is.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
I mean, Matthew just kicks it off. Like Jesus is like the one who fulfills Torah and interprets Torah and mediates Torah for the people.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You know, you start with the first gospel we have in the New Testament, Matthew, and the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus doing exactly what you were just saying there, John, that he is supposed to, a king, okay, Deuteronomy 17, the king is supposed to be intimately familiar with Torah. And he is, part of his job is to live it in a way that people are to emulate and to help people understand it. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does that exact thing. And so this is what I think is so much fun. It's like, just go back and you read those instructions, for the king, what he's not supposed to do. Johnny, you already put it out there. So I love that we're going here, because he is exactly the king that God envisioned. And sadly, his own people rejected him. Read that in John chapter 1. But Jesus is the fulfillment of the kingship. And of course, the beautiful thing is God saying, yeah, you reject him, I'll just bring him back to life. You don't get to do that. But I love how Jesus becomes the very model of kingship that God said, this is the kind of king you can have. And that challenges us. I think it undermines, to this very day, the very notion of powers and principalities and rulership and authorities and all these strata and all that kind of stuff, to say we've got this radically different model that Jesus has laid out for us. He is our king, and we give our allegiance to him, and we now use him as the example of how we live that out to this very day. I just want to keep going on and on. Like, I get all really excited about it.
I was thinking about, like, he does not set himself above the people. Like,
Yeah.
he empties himself and becomes a servant and a slave. And people keep trying to elevate him among them, and he keeps denying that. He won't even let the word out that he's the Messiah until, like, he's ready to talk about that means suffering, and it's time to suffer.
Yeah.
Like, he does the exact opposite of elevate himself. And it's like, that's Satan's temptation. I can put you over everyone.
Exactly.
So not only does he just live out that Torah, he just goes so hard in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
But, all right, so say Jesus in his personal example, doesn't live out the politics of the nations, but lives out that Torah vision of what a good king could be like. What about his people, though? Did he take the hard path so that we could be people of power and influence? Or does he call his followers to do the same thing as him?
Yeah, here's the difficult thing. So we see you guys just mentioned all the things that carry over, right? Oh, he's that king. It's still a theocracy, supposed to be, right? And Jesus is the king of it. The problem is Torah was given to a autonomous or semi-autonomous people group. Now Christians are not that, right? We are not a nation, a semi-autonomous nation. We are scattered throughout the world, right? And so this is where it becomes a little more difficult to suss out, because you can't just take it one for one, right? Now we just all got to get into the Jesus kingdom, which yes we do, except it's not exactly a kingdom. It's not of this earth, but it is, but it's not. And so like we have all these complicating factors, which is what I think this is the mistake a lot of people make. That they call something a Christian nation, so now we'll just apply these things, but it doesn't work because not everyone in there is necessarily Christian. And so I think this is where we have to think, so what does it look like for us? And unfortunately, some people, I think, revert to a more Babylon model instead of a kingdom of God model.
Yeah, and I think that what's really helpful to us is that by the time of Jesus, Israel is living an exilic existence. Okay, you still have Israel, you have Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, but the majority of Israelites are living outside of the promised land. Okay, you've got down in Egypt and all throughout Rome and in Babylon and everything like that. And so one of the things that they've had to figure out is, how do we maintain an allegiance and commitment to God in a very public, conspicuous way while living someplace other than the promised land? And so the kind of wrestling that they had to do with exilic living informed what it meant to be the people of God. And the New Testament was able to just draw upon that and go, hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
We're still an exilic people. I always joke around with my students. It's like we're living on foreign soil. We've got a green card. This is not where we live, but we are still citizens of a kingdom, and we live out that kingdom citizenship in the midst of people who are not committed to it. And so the model of exile was so useful to the early church to help Christians understand what it meant to live out that kingdom commitment in the midst of a culture that doesn't share that commitment.
Yeah, I think the exile is the key here, because, Sam's right. I mean, so much is different from Israel had their own land with its own boundaries, and there's just them, at least by Torah design.
Right.
In practice, it's more complicated.
Right, yeah.
Because of the people's disobedience, it's more complicated. But with the church, we're clearly not, God took away their land and scattered them. And so the expectation was that when the Messiah would come, he would get them back in the land and they'd
Yeah.
have their own land again. And then we can get back on the Torah track. Jesus came and said, nope, that's not what we're doing. And he makes no attempt to take over the land. And then as he's, before he ascends, he tells them, I'm going to scatter you among all nations. Yep. And now finally we, in Torah, we learned the how of how God was going to use his people to be a blessing to all nations. It's through this radically set apart way of life that lives out God's justice. Mm-hmm. I mean, let that be a summary for all the aspects of God's, the way of life to which God has called us. That's the how. It's through their set apart way of life, but that doesn't quite get to the all nations part. But how are all nations going to get in on this? And in the prophets, you have, especially in Isaiah, this vision of a city on a hill or a light to the nations, that their set apart way of life is going to shine and people will stream to them to learn. Yeah. And that was kind of the expectation. But when the Messiah comes, he combines that image of light that attracts people, that is a model, with salt, that which is scattered. Yeah. God has not drifted from his mission that his set-apart people would be a set-apart way of life that displays his justice in a way that's good for the whole world. But positionally, it's no longer Palestinocentric, right? Mm-hmm. It's not geocentric. It doesn't have one physical place on earth. It's a 7-continent world, mm-hmm. And so if we're going to be a blessing to all nations, we are going to have to go to them. So exile is both punishment to Israel, removing them from the land, but at the same time, it's positioning them for their global mission of being a blessing to all the families of the earth, right? Not just the ones in and around Palestine. And arguably, I like to think that this was God's plan from the beginning, that it was never going to be, you're great in Palestine, and people are going to hop on ships from Australia and go and take a look at your witness. I think God always had in mind his people were going to be scattered in a plurality of people groups all around the world, representing his kingship and his vision for human thriving, taking his gospel message, his good news of reconciliation to all people. I think that was always in the plan. Mm-hmm. The question is how you're going to get there, mm-hmm. right? And, maybe the reason why they were 12 scattered tribes that were relatively independent from one another is that they would get used to functioning as independent groups of people who are all part of this one mission from this one God. Maybe if they were faithful to Torah, eventually he would say, all right, now let's scatter. Right. Let's take the 12 tribes in 12 different directions and go global. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's how it would have gone had they not chosen kingship like the nations and had to develop worldly politics and worldly governance just so it could crumble under the weight of its own inadequacies, and God would have to punish them through scattering.
Yeah, I think that might be what is behind what Paul says in Galatians when he says that, the law was a pedagogue. The pedagogue was usually a slave that was assigned to travel around with the rich person's kid just to make sure that you're kept safe. The kid's too young to make his own decisions. And so the pedagogue was there to just make sure you get where you're going and nobody brings harm to you. And I think that Paul understood that in our youth, we needed safety and security. We needed a fence around the yard because we're still getting used to this idea of what being loyal to God looks like. And so God was treating us like kids. And I think what happens in exile, and this is where Antiochus comes into it, is that in the moment of persecution, Israel finally said, we will not yield. In the past, all too often, they've worshiped foreign gods or they've worshiped Yahweh, but in a very, corrupt kind of a way. And during exile, they finally got to the point where loyalty to God is so serious to us that we're willing to die for it. And they're doing it in the midst of other nations. And I can't help but think, but God's looking down and saying, all right, it took 1,000 years, but you finally figured it out. And now we can move into this next stage. And, in the fullness of time, as Paul says, God sent his son into the world. And so I'm not saying that's the full explanation. I know that there's always other things that God would add to that. But part of it is recognizing that Israel had finally reached the point where exclusive allegiance to God was one of their defining characteristics. God's like, man, I am so happy to see that. And so now we're going to move into that next stage. And so I think that one way or another, it just happened to, it came about through exile, but I'm sure God could have done it a different way had they been a more faithful nation. But to your point, John, I think that one way or another, once they could handle maintaining their faithfulness to God in the midst of foreign nations, God would have said, scatter, get out there. People need to, I don't want people coming to Israel to see this. I want you going out there and proclaiming it.
Yeah. And it's scatter as the set apart holy people of God. I mean,
Right.
the books of James and First Peter are like, books that overtly use diaspora language, scatter language, aliens, exiles language to describe the church.
Right. Yeah.
And for them, the scatter and the diaspora, the exile status is not as function, it's as mission.
Yeah.
It's
right.
how you live out, display the good works. Through your good works, you draw people to God. Like it's through your way of life in exile that people are going to get to know the God you worship.
Right.
And in First Peter, especially, like holiness language is huge. Like of all the books of the New Testament that use holiness language, Peter directly quotes from Exodus and talks about this priestly nation, right? That's kind of the language he picks up and says, that's us, that's the church. And he calls them to relate in a certain way to governing authorities. And in a future episode, we'll actually look at those passages. But just conceptually, there is a switch in the New Testament, and Jesus is the one who flips it, that diaspora, scatteredness, exile status becomes the shape of mission.
Yeah.
And it's the alternative to a set apart people living in Palestine.
Yeah.
Diaspora for mission, living out the set apart way of life. That's the shape. That's how people are going to get to the nations and draw all nations to God.
Yeah, like you say, what Peter does or what the New Testament does is that they take their new situation, which is not a nation, and says, you're still supposed to live a certain way, and you're still not supposed to be entangled in certain ways with the government. Now you just live your holy life. That's what you do. And ideally, like Deuteronomy, they look at you and say, oh, that's pretty cool. I like that. That's what it means to be salt and light. That's what it means to be a city on a hill that Jesus references. Mm-hmm. That's the way you conduct yourself is going to be like starkly different, and that's where change begins, as opposed to other controlling factors and levers of the government that you're supposed to get involved in. And Jesus never calls his people to do anything with the government except give them taxes.
Yeah.
Right? And stay out of their way.
Yeah. And you'd think if people talk a lot about Jesus being silent or not about certain topics these days, like that's one he's very silent about. And because God had other expectations for us that we're living out in his kingdom where people have certain responsibilities, but it's within the church, not in with the government proper and larger.
Yeah, there's nothing about the New Testament passages about exile that suggests that now that they are scattered among the nations, they can truly make a difference in those nations by infiltrating the governing structures of those nations and using those structures to accomplish God's mission or to help the nations accomplish their mission. Like there's nothing about exile in the New Testament or Old Testament, frankly, that implies, teaches, instructs, models, guides, anything that would suggest infiltrate them and do good.
Yeah.
Because here's the reality. Technically, legally, they wouldn't have been able to. Right? So there's like here in America, can someone who's not an American citizen become president? No, they cannot. That's just part of how it works. And so if you are an exile, if you are a foreigner in a foreign land, you wouldn't even have access to the influence. You wouldn't be able to become those things. And so it just works perfectly. We're like, yeah, so don't even bother. Let's do this other thing that's more along the lines of what God's plan is for his people.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's important for people to keep in mind is that even before Christians are out there proclaiming the good news of Jesus, Israelites are having a positive effect in their communities, because you see it like in the book of Acts, where Paul will go to one of these cities like Philippi or Corinth or whatever, and he'll speak to the Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. Like there was something about the lifestyle of these diaspora Israelites that at least certain Gentiles looked at and said, I want to know more about that. Unfortunately, the majority of people didn't, but there were still a few who were like, I'd like to hear more. I'd like to learn more about this. And they start showing up in the synagogues and they're listening to Torah being read and all that. And so Israel is already beginning to embrace that just by the very lives that they lived. And I think I think sometimes modern Christians want to look at Israel and just saying what a failed experiment that was. It's like, no, they were doing a lot of good work in order to prepare the gospel of Jesus. So yeah, don't lose sight of that.
Yeah. Now, Sam, you brought up something about, the reality is, even if they wanted to back then, they couldn't have done it because the politics was not set up that way.
Right.
Although, arguably, there was room in the Roman Empire for citizens to work their way up and exercise influence and even share a little bit of the power. But I hear people with that say, and that's the only reason they didn't infiltrate the powers to accomplish God's purposes, because they weren't allowed to. Now that we're in America and they invite you to influence them, to infiltrate the powers, to use those levers to accomplish your vision for a better America, now that we're allowed to, we're responsible to. We have that obligation. Is the only reason they didn't do it in the first century because they couldn't?
No, I don't. I don't think that's. Well, no, I don't think that's the case. I just think that's the nature of God's people throughout time have always been the minority and not the ones in power, which is partly, I think, how God wanted it. And so, when you start with Jeremiah, where they're in Babylon, and what are they supposed to do? Become religious leaders? No. Or become political leaders? No. They're supposed to pray and live their lives and be good influences. In the first century Roman Empire, I guess they could have done something, but not really. Paul was the exception because he was part Roman citizen and these other things. And so, and even Paul, who would have had the opportunity to maybe do something, also chose not to, because that's not what Christians were called to do. They were called to be something very distinct. And so just because circumstances would allow for it at times doesn't mean that it changes our calling.
Yeah, and that to me is really key, because we have throughout the Old Testament, God uses fallen, broken world powers, governing authorities, power-hungry people to help keep chaos at bay throughout the world, a plurality of powers and principalities to generate a certain level of peace and calm and order in society, so that his set-apart people can be salt and light and then do this redemptive mission. Like the world powers are the orders of preservation. They keep the world from totally falling apart. But the set-apart people of God are the orders of redemption. They usher in, welcome God's new order, his kingdom, his vision for human thriving in the world, in their life together. They are a glimpse of the kingdom to come that's on display among the kingdoms that are, right? And that's the mission. That's what you get baptized into, to seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, his justice. That's why we get baptized. I want to seek first God's kingdom. And that always meant for a first century believer, and not the kingdoms of the world.
Right.
Like, to seek first God's kingdom is to not seek first the kingdoms of the world.
Yeah.
And it was convenient because as exiles, the kingdoms of the world weren't asking them to forsake their Christian calling to do the kingdoms of the world's job. But America's different. They ask us to forsake our Christian calling and to make America's calling our calling. And then people say, and because of that invitation to seek first a different kingdom, we are obligated to say yes. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I think that to just reinforce that, going back to our last episode where, Israel, like Abram was called out of Ur. And we've talked about that coming out of the world. Jews already, they lived that in the Roman Empire. Like, they had exceptions about not going to temples and stuff like that. But I think Gentiles, they're the ones who really faced the challenge of embracing the new kingdom. Because, like, the first thing you do in embracing God's kingdom is you turn away from idolatry. That's just like the number one thing. We have an exclusive allegiance to the God of Israel, Yahweh Elohim, and his son Jesus. And as soon as you do that, you're pulling back from participation in idolatry temples or temples dedicated to Rome and things like that. And a lot of that was tied to your allegiance to Rome and your local community and all of that. And so when you go up and offer sacrifices to Rome or to the Caesars, part of what you're saying is, I am a loyal citizen of the empire. And now it's like, I can't do that anymore. I can't be a part of that. Well, once you start saying no to those commitments, you're no longer allowed to be a part of the ruling class. Like people are like, well, they didn't have the opportunity. It's like, well, let's say that you accumulate enough wealth or you accumulate enough land, and it's like, okay, I'm kind of rising among the ranks. Actually, now you do have an opportunity to be a part of local aristocracy. And some Christians were already a part of the local aristocracy. But the moment you start pulling back from the commitments of that aristocracy, whether it be in the local city or Rome, now you're looked at with a lot of suspicion. And I think that's really important because for us, a commitment to Jesus is going to be coming out from the world. It's going to be turning our back on the world's priorities. And the world's going to say, fine, you want to live that life? Let's see how that goes for you. And so if they're inviting us to be a part of it, there's probably an invitation that says, and here are the things that go along with it. And are those things going to undermine our exclusive allegiance to Jesus? So it's not as different as people want to make it out to be, our experience versus their experience 2,000 years ago.
If I can put a finer point on it, I think the invitation that your country or your world offers you to participate is an invitation to become kingship like the nations.
Amen.
That's what they're doing. And by you saying, sure, I can balance the two, you're saying, I want a kingship like the nations, which is exactly like the last episode said, was the wrong way to go.
Right. Yeah.
Which led to the downfall of Israel. Like how many times do we see it in how many ways to say this is not okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have these conversations all the time with people like, yeah, but there's always the but. And like, no, you're either called out or you're not. Yeah. You're either holy and set apart or you're 1 foot in each, in each camp. I think John has some things to say about that in Revelation. I don't know.
Maybe a thing or two. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe we confuse things when we focus in the Old Testament on kingship like the nations, because it focuses on the individual. But I mean, that's a part of the Torah vision. And so maybe we should start saying what God forbade in Torah in 17 and the chapters around that in Deuteronomy is kingdom like the nations.
Kingdom, yes.
Yeah.
It's God's vision is not kingdom like the nations. And so you can't have a king like the nations because the kings like the nations make kingdom like the nations.
Yeah.
And you're not a kingdom like the nations. And so the invitation today, can we get involved in the kingdom like the nations, but use that to accomplish kingdom of God purposes? It's just, I don't know, it's that cross purposes with the direction of the Bible story. Like they embrace kingdom like the nations. That was their greatest act of unfaithfulness in the Old Testament. Like all 39 books, not that they'll talk about it, but like a central theme of the story is that the greatest act of unfaithfulness is his people rejecting kingdom like Torah and embracing kingdom like the nations. That is the greatest thing that they are punished for. They succeed at it under Solomon, and David, but God rips it from them. I gave you a king in my anger, and I ripped him away in my wrath, right? Like God brought that all to a crashing halt and says, I'm going to give you a king not like the other kings, and I'm going to inaugurate a kingdom not like the kingdoms of this world, and my kingdom's going to replace, according to Daniel, the kingdoms of this world.
Right.
And it's not going to be like them, and it's going to be a kingdom, according to Daniel, not made by human hands.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which means not made by the Greeks or the Romans or the Babylonians or the Assyrians, and not by Israelite human hands. It's going to be God's kingdom, which is why it's called in Matthew a kingdom of heaven. It's from God. He sources it, and it's of his nature, and it reflects his glory. And it's so funny. The offer given to Jesus numerous times in the Gospels is kingdom like the nations. Like that's what the devil was offering him.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
when he says, I can give you all the nations here, just bow before me. I can give you the kingdoms of the world. And Jesus rejects it. And his followers and the crowds try to make him king and offer him the kingdoms of the world. And he rejects it. And even when Pilate starts talking about, I don't know, are you a king? Of course, Pilate thinks, are you a king like the nation? Are you a king like me? Are you about what I'm about? And Jesus is like, dude, you have no idea who you're talking to and what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, because when Pilate asked him that question, Jesus said, my servants will be fighting for my arrest. If you think that I am a king like you're thinking, I'd have an army. And I don't. I don't have an army. I don't have armed people. So, no. It's like, yeah, I'm a king, but not the way you're thinking. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier in this episode, that God is giving us this radically different vision of what kingship should look like. And it's just not going to look like it. And that's why Pilate's like, this guy's not a problem. Like, he thinks Jesus is a threat to Rome, and he's like, this guy's not a problem. Probably thinks he's a crackpot, but he's not a problem. And he ends up, doing the politically expedient thing of like, hey, you want him dead? I'll kill him. Not a big deal. But he realizes that Jesus is not a threat in the way he thinks. He is a threat.
He's a much bigger threat than that.
Yeah, he's a much bigger threat than he realizes, but he's not a threat in the way that he's thinking of it. But yeah, when Jesus gets his way, Pilate and Rome are going to lose all the things they hold dear.
Yeah, and I suspect Jesus respects the role Pilate has because Jesus read the Old Testament. Like, he knew that God uses the powers and principalities to keep order. And this is just one of those powers and principalities under God's jurisdiction that helps keep order in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Like, he's got a role, he's got a function. And he reminds them that little function you have, you have authority on loan from God.
Yeah.
You're functioning for him. And you wouldn't have that if it were not for him. And so he has no desire to depose Pilate in his function as an agent among the orders of preservation. Because that's just not Jesus's game for his people. He is raising up a people who will advance the order of redemption, the order of salvation. He has no desire to compete with those who have the limited job of serving as global custodians. Mm-hmm. He is the main attraction, and all of world history is culminating in his kingdom, which is replacing all the kingdoms of this world.
Right, yeah.
And all the kingdoms of the world have a temporary function. They have power on loan from God. They are lame duck rulers. And this is where I think do justice to this conversation, we have to think in terms of eschatology, right? Like, in Jesus, the kingdom of God is breaking in.
Yeah.
God's politics, God's governing authority over the world is taking shape among these kingdom communities that Paul went around the world planting, and other apostles as they made disciples of all nations. Like, these people are the foretaste now of the kingdom to come that's replacing all the kingdoms of the world. And right now, the kingdom of God is breaking into world history through the kingdom communities of the church. Which is the alternative politics that's not like the kingdoms of this world, that doesn't fight the wars of this world and use the weapons of this world. And like, that's the Christian part in this story. And the powers and principalities, the government authorities of this world, who are not for God's kingdom, but for worldly kingdoms, their part in this story is to keep preserving order until Christ returns and their function is retired permanently. Mm-hmm. And there's no future for the orders that they're maintaining. The only place where the future is that will survive the return of Christ is the politics and kingdom of God, which are lived out now, in the kingdom communities, the church that is scattered throughout the world. That's what time it is in world history.
Yeah.
We are on the cutting edge. If you're a part of the church, if you seek first God's kingdom, if you're contributing to the visibility of a kingdom reign of God in your town, in your city, you are on the cutting edge of world history. Mm-hmm. And the thing you're investing in now is the future of world history. Yeah. And if you spend most of your time, energy, of resources thinking about who's in power in Washington over the United States of America, one country on one continent, and if that's what gets you worked up, if that's what's got your interest, if that's what keeps you scrolling and watching YouTube videos, if that's what your obsession is, then you're obsessed with a kingdom that is passing away and has no future when Christ returns. And so it's, the offer that the world gives us to join them in the task of world preservation is, it just seems, it's hard to say that's not another temptation of the devil.
Mm-hmm. I was actually thinking the same thing earlier. Like, it's a satanic thing in the sense of a testing thing. Like, which one do you want to choose? This one or this one? And like, I don't know. They're both pretty good. And we fail that test when we join in with the politics of this world. And I think for me, the difficult thing is when you talk about these two different, they're concurrent. And we as Christians know one will continue and one will fall away. But because they're both here in front of us at the same time, I don't know if it's our human nature. I don't know what it is, but it's difficult to say, oh, well, I'll act like that one doesn't exist and focus completely on the kingdom of God. And so we usually, as I say, we try to go between them, or we're all in on one versus the other. I don't know if this illustration is any good or not, but it's like the difference between a flip phone and a modern cell phone, right? They're going away. Like it's not cutting edge anymore, guys. Now, cell phones back in the day, flip phones were. Now they're not. Right. And so, but we're choosing the flip phone. Like who in their right mind would do that these days? And so yet plenty of Christians do.
Yeah.
They're choosing the lesser when the better, the cutting edge, the whatever is over here in the kingdom of God. And they just don't realize it.
I think the analogy would be the corded phone
Okay, sure.
that is connected through a wired connection to wired stations that service areas, right? That's more like the kingdoms of this world. And like the cell phone, no, we're tied to a global network.
Yeah.
Right. And, you can't splice these two together because the nature of the wired thing is it has a geographic span. But of course, the difference in technologies where your analogy is. But I think like once you add the wire to it, that's where we got to think of the nations of this world. They're still wired to a central hub. And at the center of that hub sits Satan's throne.
Yeah.
Because it's the kingdoms of the world that are passing away. And that throne just keeps getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
I think it's about a good spot to break. I can speak. I do this for a living. So we have more to say. We'll talk about, how God's kingdom is continuing, but we've got to stop here. So thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class, because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Social media pictures and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris. Audio mixing and editing is done by Drew Nyquist. If you've enjoyed this episode of ACP, you might also enjoy GLCC's Master of Arts in Practical Theology degree. In this 36-hour program, you will receive first-rate biblical and theological instruction from John, Ron, Sam, and several of their colleagues at Great Lakes Christian College. To learn more about this program, visit glcc.edu. Get practical and go deep at GLCC.